Good morning, St. Paul's. Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo and looked out over the vast lands before him. He saw it with his own eyes, but he did not cross into them. Moses died in the land of Moab. So I'm making an assumption here, but if Moses is anything like us, I suspect that he felt deflated about not entering into the promised land. He had had this dramatic escape from Egypt and had sojourned for 40 years in the wilderness with this goal in mind, to enter into the promised land. And then to get this close on top of Mount Nebo, he can see it right there. It's right there. And to not make it in, it had to be disappointing. It had to be crushing. Well, your life and my life, our lives, are littered with little gravestones and mourning. Not mourning as in not evening, but mourning, grief. We can ask the questions, how did this happen? How did I get here or end up in this situation? Things have not turned out like we anticipated. And we rehearse then all of the what ifs. What if I had only done this? Or if this had not happened? Or if that, if they. And we play these out in our minds. And of course there's no answer to the question why. Why did this happen? That's one of the great mysteries, right? And in fact, like Job, we can begin to ask the question why. And what it actually kind of is in reality is a subpoena to God, right? God, I demand that you come give me an explanation as to why this happened to me. You're the one in control. Why? And so we demand an answer to our plight. But what do we do with our broken dreams? The dashed hopes that we've all encountered, our grief, our sorrow, and our mourning. Well, the reality is most of us are well adept at kind of stuffing these emotions down, cramming them down into some dark closet in the deep basements of our hearts. And we think maybe if I just ignore them, it'll go away. Even as we do that, though, for many of us, our faces will betray us, or our tone of voice might betray us and give us away. And so even if we try to stuff it, we reveal ourselves that we're going through something. Now, we may not react like the ancient Hebrews did. If you read about how they went through mourning, they would rub ash in their hair and cast dust upon themselves and wear sackcloth, this itchy stuff that reminded them that they were going through something uncomfortable. And they would pierce the air with this wail, a wailing. And we don't do those things here in the West, in the United States. But I'll tell you what, if you've ever heard that wail, a wail of mourning, it will curdle your blood and you won't likely forget it. I heard it when I was in Africa. We happened to come across a funeral gathering, and I don't know if it was pre or post or whatever, but this crowd of people and these ladies were wailing, just piercing the air with their grief and their sorrow, just embodying all the what was inside of them. They were letting it out. And we don't tend to let it out. Well, as you know, there are points in our lives which have produced loss. Our hopes have been dashed suddenly, maybe quite unexpectedly. Our lives change, or someone's gone, relationships, careers, the death of a dream or the death of a loved one, maybe a failed business. Now, there are hundreds of people in California whose homes are there one day and burned to the ground the next. Everything's gone. Sudden loss. Gone. What do you do with that? Grief, it strikes us. We're sick at the heart. And it may be so powerful that we're inwardly paralyzed. Despair, darkness, waves of emotional exhaustion begin to wash over us. Hopelessness and mental anguish. The events and the moments, these times when these things happen, we can get stuck there. Obviously, time marches on and we continue to age and maybe go about our lives, but we can get locked into that grief and sorrow. And it's then baggage that comes with us forward into our lives. And we end up wearing this grief and sorrow like the chains burdening Marley's ghost in A Christmas Carol. In fact, I was participating in some continuing education this week via Zoom with probably 50 to 60 people around the world. In fact, there was someone in Western Australia who was up doing this at 2 a.m. to be part of this live Zoom conference. And at the end, there was this young woman who began to share, and it was so heartfelt about abuse she had suffered as a little girl, and she was probably in her mid to late 20s. Well, this was baggage that she's been carrying since she was this little girl, this grief and this sorrow and this anger, and she didn't know what to do with it. And that's so many of us. It's our story. Let me read to you a portion of Psalm 30. Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You've taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, so that my soul may praise you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? We all want to hear those words when we're going through grief, and they're actually so relevant right now, right? The past 8 months for all of us has brought some despair and some grieving and sorrow, confusion, sudden loss of life like we knew it. How can I get this exchange that I hear about in Psalm 30 where my mourning is turned into dancing? Well, a few thoughts. First, it's going to take some courage. As I said earlier, we tend to stuff these emotions down because we don't want to face them. And we think that strength comes if we will face life with this kind of stiff upper lip and go forward. And that shows our resolve to conquer the day. And while that sounds good, it just means we're avoiding the situation. Here's a quotation from Brené Brown I thought was helpful describing this in a way. Quote, "It's easier to live disappointed than it is to feel disappointed. It feels more vulnerable to dip in and out of disappointment than just to simply set up your camp there. If you set up your camp there, you sacrifice joy, but you suffer less pain." Right? It's saying, well, if I just don't set my sights very high and I don't have many expectations, I won't be disappointed. So just live beneath what you've been called to. And that's what she's talking about here. Stiff upper lip. If I just decide to camp in my sorrow a bit, I'm less vulnerable, and maybe I won't feel as much pain, but it numbs us. So it'll take courage to face our pain, our grief, and our sorrow. Next, once again, let's consider the Incarnation. And when you hear incarnation, don't simply think about, well, that's Jesus being born in Bethlehem in a manger. I mean, that's part of it. But the incarnation is his entire life, which continues. His taking on human flesh in complete solidarity with us, because God has become human. He identifies with us and our experience. You might say God enmeshes himself with us and in us. What I'm saying is that when it comes to grief and sorrow, for God, this is no longer hearsay. He knows exactly what it's like to be human and experience grief and sorrow and loss. Oh, Jerusalem, why will you not listen to me? I've tried to care for you like a hen cares for her chicks. I want so much for you to live, but you're going down a path of destruction, broken-hearted. Oh, my dear friend Lazarus, I know that you can be resuscitated and live, but it didn't take away from the human grief and sorrow and pain that he felt with his friends about the death of his friend. Judas, Peter, James, John, mother. I mean, think about Jesus from the cross looking down at his mother and the grief he must have felt for her, that she's watching her son be treated this way. You see, God is not remote up there watching us, kind of collecting data. He has made our mourning his own mourning. He knows what it is to mourn and to grieve. Think about this. In his crucifixion and resurrection, we know that Jesus, he goes into death, right? He's in the tomb for 3 days. Now, this may not be the only reason, but one thing to think about is why 3 days? I mean, why not just die and come on back? He didn't have to wait, I don't suppose, right? He's got the power to conquer death. Well, perhaps one aspect of it is that in those 3 days, he joins us in our mourning. The disciples, his mother, mourning his death. If he'd come back right away, they wouldn't have entered into that process, but entering into that deep grief with us. But he does come out, defeating death once and for all, canceling it, reversing it. The course now is life and not death. So, back to those little gravestones which litter our timelines in our lives, we still experience loss, no doubt about it. But right now, since the resurrection, we are continually beckoned forward into life. You might remember in one of the gospel accounts, at the resurrection, Mary thinks it's the gardener and then realizes that it's Jesus. And he says, don't cling to me. And we might wonder, what exactly is that saying? Well, I think one of the things it's saying is not that he's not fully human. Clearly he is. We find out that he tells Thomas, touch me, I'm flesh and blood, I'm not a ghost, and he's eating with them. So it's not like, well, hold on, I'm still kind of transforming in like in Star Trek, whenever they would teleport in or whatever, and you can't quite touch me yet. I think that's bogus. I think he's saying, don't cling to me, because we're not going back to the way things were. It's not like, oh, Jesus, I'm so glad to have you back. We'll get back to Galilee and we'll go back on the preaching tour and you'll continue to heal people and we're going to have things the way that we were, the way things were. He says, no, I'm going to my Father. You know this and I know this. Life does not return to how it was prior to our mourning and grief. Something new must be underway. I think this is don't cling to me. We're not going back to the way it was. Something new is about to happen. Mourning turns to dancing. And of course, this is the meaning then that's wrapped up in metanoia, repentance, exchanging our minds of grief and mourning and sorrow and gravestones and death for his mind, which is resurrection life. I see the hope that is in him, that he's included me in that resurrection. Do you see that? We're in him in the resurrection. I don't have to do anything. How can I get resurrected? No, you've been included in it. He's reversed it. And it changes everything. We participate in his hope and in his life. This is not just a second chance. It's redemption into something new. So, hear me clearly. This is not just cheer up. No tears here. Stiff upper lip. You know now your morning's been turned into dancing. That's just another religious law that's phony. There is nothing phony about Jesus Christ. He's not asking us just to whistle a happy tune and ignore our grief and sorrow. He knows what it's like. And he's entered into it with us, but he sets us on the course of life, saying, you've been included in my resurrection. That's the dance. Mourning into dancing. We're part of the dance because we're in him. So finally, very quickly, how do we begin to touch upon what I'm describing here? How can I experience some of this mourning into dancing? Well, I think one possibility is, as I said, we like to stuff things. And this would be an exercise in not stuffing things. And so it's to write down our own psalm of lament. And the Psalms of Lament, which is actually the largest number of psalms that we have in the Psalter, are, well, let's put it this way, they're complaining to God in faith. Right? So, and they're really getting raw. It's why we like the Psalms. I mean, we're being real honest with God. It's a prayer of faith that comes out of our pain. And I think it can be a wonderful spiritual vehicle for release and transformation in our grief and sorrow. So, how do we do that? I'm not going to tell you right now because this sermon would take too long. But tomorrow's Salt and Light, I will be going through the steps of writing a psalm of lament so that you can do this. And hopefully, prayerfully, it will be a help in your life. So tomorrow's Salt and Light, we'll be talking about how do I now write this psalm of lament. When we go through grief and sorrow and pain and mourning, it's not an indication that we're bad or that we've missed it or that we're wrong. It's proof that we hurt. It's proof that we hurt. And so we believe God, but this is an exercise of not just saying, well, I believe that you're God, but do we trust him? I trust you enough that I'm going to be honest and I'm going to rail in this lament. I'm going to write down exactly the things that I'm feeling and going through. Will God get mad at me? No. He's much larger than your railings. Can I trust him with my grief and my sorrow, my mess? You betcha. He knows exactly what it's like to mourn. Amen.